Black boy tells judge you're my mom. The courtroom freezes when 13-year-old Ethan stands up in court and drops a bombshell. The truth shakes everyone to their core. A story of pain, secrets, and second chances unfolds. Can a broken family find its way back together? If this story pulls at your heartstrings and keeps you wanting more, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales full of twists and emotion. The courtroom was an imposing place with its high ceilings, polished wooden benches, and the faint scent of varnish lingering in the air. The room felt cold, not just because of the air conditioning, but because of the heavy tension that hung there like a storm cloud. People sat in hushed silence, their eyes drawn to the boy standing at the defendant's table. Ethan Taylor was 13, but he didn't look it. He was small for his age, his frame thin, and his hoodie hung off his shoulders like it belonged to someone else. His hands rested on the table in front of him, his knuckles white from how hard he was gripping it. But his eyes, those dark brown eyes, burned with something older than his years, a mixture of defiance, sadness, and a longing he couldn't hide. Judge Rebecca Lane sat on the bench above him, presiding over the courtroom. Her reputation preceded her, calm, impartial, and always in control. She had handled countless cases, from petty crimes to violent felonies, without breaking a sweat. But today there was something different about her demeanor. She was trying to mask it, but as her sharp gaze flickered toward Ethan, something in her eyes softened just for a moment. The prosecutor, a tall man with a clipped tone and a stack of neatly organized papers, began to speak. Your Honor, the defendant, Ethan Taylor, was caught trespassing on private property. The owner has provided clear evidence of. Ethan wasn't listening. His lawyer, a balding man with round glasses and an air of nervous energy, leaned down to whisper something in his ear, but Ethan shrugged him off without looking. His eyes were locked on the judge. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. The air around him seemed to crackle with unspoken words. Rebecca's voice broke the prosecutor's rhythm. Ethan Taylor, she said, addressing him directly. Her voice was firm, yet not unkind. Do you understand the charges against you? The boy didn't answer. His lawyer nudged him gently, whispering again, but Ethan didn't move. The courtroom grew restless, murmurs rippling through the gallery. Rebecca's eyebrows furrowed, but she kept her composure. She leaned forward slightly, her robe shifting as she clasped her hands together on the bench. Ethan, she said again, louder this time, I need you to answer me. Do you understand the charges? Still, Ethan said nothing. The boy seemed frozen, his gaze piercing through her. And then, with a sharp intake of breath, he stood up. His movements were jerky, like he was fighting to hold himself together. The murmurs in the room ceased, and all eyes locked on him. Ethan's voice broke the silence. It was shaky, raw, but loud enough for everyone to hear. You're my mom. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, it felt like the entire courtroom had stopped breathing. A journalist in the back row dropped their pen, the clatter echoing like a gunshot. Ethan's lawyer froze, his mouth hanging open in stunned disbelief. Even the bailiff, a burly man with arms crossed over his chest, stood motionless, blinking as if he hadn't heard right. Rebecca Lane was no exception. Her calm, composed facade cracked as her face turned pale. Her hand, which had been poised over the gavel, fell limply to her side. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. For the first time in her career, she looked utterly unprepared. What did you say? Rebecca's voice wavered, barely louder than a whisper. Ethan took a shaky step forward, his small frame trembling with the effort to hold himself upright. His hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. His voice cracked with emotion as he repeated himself. You're my mom. You left me. Why did you leave me? The silence in the room was deafening. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as if time itself had stopped. Rebecca's face, usually so composed and authoritative, now betrayed a storm of emotions. Shock, guilt, pain. Her eyes, sharp and piercing just moments ago, now looked wide and vulnerable, like those of someone who had just seen a ghost. Her hand trembled as she reached for her gavel, but she didn't slam it down. Instead, she let it rest there, her fingers brushing over the smooth wood as if grounding herself. Her lips moved, but no words came out. She looked down at Ethan, her eyes searching his face for something. Recognition, truth, forgiveness. Ethan didn't look away. His tears brimmed but didn't fall. His jaw clenched as he fought to keep his voice steady. "Why did you leave me?" he asked again, softer this time. "Why didn't you come back?" Rebecca's breathing quickened, and she leaned back in her chair as if the weight of his words had physically pushed her. She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker, ready to burst, but no one dared to break the silence. Finally, Rebecca forced herself to speak. Her voice was barely audible, and the strength that usually carried her words was gone. "Bailiff," she said, her voice trembling. "We'll take a short recess." The bailiff nodded, breaking the spell that had frozen the room. He moved toward Ethan, gently taking his arm, but Ethan didn't resist. He glanced back at Rebecca one last time, his eyes filled with a mix of anger, sadness, and something else, something desperate. Then he let the bailiff lead him away. As the doors closed behind him, the murmurs erupted. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes, the gallery buzzed with whispers, and the prosecutor leaned over to Rebecca's clerk, asking in a hushed tone, "What the hell just happened?" But Rebecca didn't hear any of it. She sat frozen on the bench, her hands gripping the edge of her desk as if holding herself in place. Her mind raced, her chest tightening with emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The boy's words echoed in her ears. "You're my mom. You left me." She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, but the tears slipped out anyway, streaking silently down her face. For 13 years, Rebecca Lane had buried her past. But now it was standing in her courtroom, staring her in the face and demanding answers. Answers she wasn't sure she had. Rebecca Lane bolted from the courtroom like a woman fleeing a nightmare. Her judicial robe swayed behind her as she strode through the halls, her heels echoing off the marble floors. The whispers and stares of clerks and reporters followed her, but she didn't care. All she could focus on was the storm of emotions roaring inside her. She slammed the door to her private chambers shut, leaning against it as if to keep the world and the truth out. But the truth had already found her, spoken in the trembling voice of a boy who had called her mom. Her breathing was uneven, her heart pounding against her ribs. Rebecca staggered toward her desk, her hand brushing against a stack of legal documents, sending them fluttering to the floor. She didn't pick them up. Instead, her eyes fell on a small framed photograph. She grabbed it, holding it as though it might burn her fingers. The picture was from her wedding day, 13 years ago. She and her husband, Mark, stood smiling, young and full of promise. She let out a shaky breath as her eyes fell to the edges of the photo, where Ethan's declaration replayed in her mind. "You're my mom." The memories came rushing back, unbidden and unstoppable. A hospital room. A tiny baby swaddled in a blanket, his wide brown eyes staring up at her, her heart aching as she signed the papers, her hands trembling as she handed him to the adoption worker. She had been so young, so terrified. She convinced herself she was doing the right thing, that someone else could give him the life she never could. But Ethan's eyes in the courtroom today were the same. Older, yes. Harder. But they held the same intensity that had haunted her dreams for years. The boy was hers. He had found her. And now her carefully constructed life. Her career, her reputation, her mask of perfection was collapsing under the weight of the past. Rebecca slumped into her chair, the photo slipping from her fingers and landing face down on the desk. She buried her face in her hands, tears stinging her eyes. For years, she had buried Ethan in a corner of her mind, convincing herself he was better off. She had told herself he was happy, loved, and thriving. But now, hearing the pain in his voice, seeing the anger in his eyes, she knew she had been lying to herself all along. Meanwhile, in the juvenile waiting room, Ethan sat on a hard plastic chair, his arms crossed over his chest. His lawyer, Mr. Carter, hovered nearby, clearly unsure of what to say. He had been blindsided by Ethan's outburst, just like everyone else. "Ethan," Mr. Carter began carefully, "do you want to talk about what happened in there?" Ethan glared at him. "What's there to talk about?" "Well," Carter fumbled with his words, "that's a big accusation you made in court. If there's someone, you're trying to find, we can." "She's my mom," Ethan cut him off sharply. His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it, like a knife against stone. "I don't need a DNA test or proof or whatever it is you lawyers like. I know it." Carter hesitated. "But she can't pretend I don't exist anymore," Ethan snapped, his voice rising. "She can't just sit there in her stupid robe and act like she doesn't know me." Carter stared at the boy for a long moment, then sighed, nodding slightly. "All right," he said softly. "All right, Ethan." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze hardening as he stared at the sterile walls of the room. He didn't care what anyone else thought. He had seen the look on her face, the way her hands had trembled and her voice had cracked. She knew. She had always known. Rebecca forced herself to return to the courtroom. She couldn't let her emotions show. At least, not to the gallery full of spectators, reporters, and legal professionals waiting for her return. Her walk back to the bench felt like a death march, each step heavier than the last. By the time she sat down, her face was a mask of calm composure, but it was brittle, ready to shatter at the slightest pressure. Ethan was back at the defendant's table, his lawyer whispering to him urgently. Rebecca couldn't hear what was being said, but Ethan's body language made it clear he wasn't listening. His arms were crossed, his jaw set, his eyes staring straight ahead, straight at her. Rebecca adjusted her glasses with trembling hands. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, the curious stares, the subtle murmurs. Everyone wanted to know what she was going to do. Everyone wanted to know if it was true. The prosecutor cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the proceedings. "Your Honor, as I was saying earlier, the defendant. Why didn't you come back for me?" The prosecutor froze mid-sentence. The room went dead silent. Rebecca's gavel slipped from her hand, clattering onto her desk. She looked up to see Ethan standing again, his fists clenched at his sides. His voice was breaking, but he kept going, the words spilling out like water from a dam. "Why didn't you come back?" he repeated, louder this time. "Why didn't you even try?" Rebecca opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her throat felt dry, her chest tight. She stared at Ethan, her composure crumbling as his raw pain filled the room. "Ethan," she began, but he cut her off. "No," he shouted, slamming his hands on the table. "You don't get to tell me what this is. You don't get to act like this is just some normal case. You left me. You threw me away like I didn't matter." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The bailiff took a step forward, but Rebecca held up a hand to stop him. She could feel the stares drilling into her, the judgment of everyone in the room. But none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the boy standing in front of her, the boy she had abandoned. For a moment, Rebecca's mask slipped entirely. Her face crumpled, the weight of guilt and regret showing in every line. But then, like a shield, she forced herself to put it back on. Her voice, when it came, was soft and strained. "Bailiff," she said, barely audible, "take the defendant into custody. I'll make my ruling tomorrow." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Ethan stared at her, his eyes filled with betrayal. He didn't resist as the bailiff took his arm, but he looked back at her as he was led away. That look, so full of pain, anger, and heartbreak, was the worst thing Rebecca had ever seen. When the doors closed behind him, the courtroom erupted in whispers. But Rebecca didn't hear them. She sat there, frozen, her hands trembling on the bench. She had spent years building her life into something respectable, something untouchable. But now, the foundation of that life was cracking, and she didn't know how to stop it from collapsing. All she could hear was Ethan's voice echoing in her mind. "Why didn't you come back for me?" For the first time in her career, Judge Rebecca Lane didn't have an answer. Rebecca sat alone in her dimly lit living room, the silence pressing against her like a heavy weight. In front of her sat an old shoebox, its edges worn and soft with age, like the memories it held. Her trembling hands rested on its lid as though afraid to open it, to confront the fragments of a past she had spent years trying to bury. The box was small but carried a lifetime of emotions. Inside were photographs, faded and curled at the edges, letters she had written but never sent, and one fragile piece of paper that seemed to mock her every time she looked at it. Ethan's birth certificate. Her name was there in bold letters under Mother. The space for the father's name was blank. Rebecca picked up the birth certificate with shaky hands, her tears splashing onto the paper as her vision blurred. She remembered the day it was printed, the day she had stared down at her newborn son, his tiny body swaddled in a hospital blanket, his dark brown eyes meeting hers with an innocence that had broken her heart. She had whispered to him that she loved him more than anything in the world. That was the same day she had handed him to a social worker, her arms feeling empty and hollow the moment he was gone. She had convinced herself it was the right choice. She had told herself over and over that someone else could give him the life she couldn't. But now, staring at the birth certificate, the guilt was suffocating. She had failed him. She hadn't been strong enough to keep him, and she hadn't been brave enough to find him. Rebecca closed her eyes, clutching the certificate to her chest as sobs racked her body. Ethan's words from the courtroom replayed in her mind. "Why didn't you come back for me?" The pain in his voice had cut her deeper than any accusation she'd faced in her career, and she deserved every bit of it. She reached for a photo from the shoebox, a snapshot of Ethan as a baby, taken the day before she gave him up. His face was chubby and bright, his toothless smile beaming up at her from the faded picture. Her fingers traced the edges of the photo as a fresh wave of tears fell. She whispered into the empty room, her voice cracking, "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I'm so sorry." The next morning, Rebecca walked into the packed courtroom, her face a mask of neutrality, but her heart heavy with dread. Whispers buzzed through the crowd as she approached the bench. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, and the gallery was filled with people who had come to witness the fallout of yesterday's revelation. Rebecca scanned the room briefly and found Ethan sitting at the defendant's table. He looked different today. His defiance was gone, replaced by a quiet determination. His head was held high, but his eyes shimmered with unused tears. He didn't look at her, but she could feel his presence, like an unrelenting weight pressing down on her. Rebecca cleared her throat and adjusted her glasses, gripping the edge of the bench as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. The courtroom fell silent as she began to speak. "I have a statement to make before we proceed," she announced, her voice steady but soft. "After yesterday's events, I feel it is my duty to address what has been said in this courtroom." Ethan finally looked up at her, his expression unreadable. His lawyer leaned forward slightly, watching intently. Rebecca took a deep breath. "I can confirm," she said slowly, "that Ethan Taylor is my biological son." The room exploded into murmurs and gasps. Reporters scrambled to take notes, and the prosecutor's jaw fell open in shock. Even the bailiff, who had likely seen everything in his career, looked startled. Rebecca raised her hand, calling for order. However, she continued, her voice firm now, "That does not change the fact that this is a court of law, and the charges against him must still be addressed. As a judge, I am bound to remain impartial, regardless of personal connections." The crowd settled down, but the tension in the room remained electric. Ethan stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape. His face was flushed, his hands balled into fists at his sides. You still don't care about me, do you? He said, his voice trembling with anger. You care more about your rules and your job than you ever cared about me. Rebecca's composure wavered. Her lips parted as though she wanted to respond, but Ethan didn't give her a chance. You're just like you were back then, he said, his voice rising. You made your choice. You left me. And now you want to sit there like none of it matters. Like I don't matter. Ethan, that's enough, Rebecca said, her voice cracking as she reached for her gavel. But Ethan wasn't finished. He slammed his hands on the table, his voice raw with pain. You're not my mom. You're just a stranger in a robe. The room went silent again, but this silence was heavier, sharper, cutting through everyone present. Ethan's words hung in the air like an accusation, and for a moment, it seemed like even the walls of the courtroom felt the weight of them. Rebecca's hand froze over her gavel. Her mask of control, the armor she had built over years of navigating the legal world, cracked for the second time. She stared at Ethan, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt, sorrow, and something else. Helplessness. Ethan, she began, but her voice faltered. She didn't know what to say. How could she respond to a boy whose pain was her fault, whose anger was justified? Ethan shook his head, his expression hardening. Don't bother, he said bitterly. You don't get to fix this. He sat back down, crossing his arms and staring at the floor. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but Ethan shrugged it off, refusing to look at anyone. Rebecca finally gripped her gavel and slammed it down. We'll continue this case tomorrow, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The bailiff approached Ethan to escort him out of the courtroom. As he stood, Ethan glanced back at Rebecca one last time. His eyes no longer burned with anger, but with something far worse. Disappointment. It was a look Rebecca knew would haunt her forever. As the courtroom emptied, Rebecca sat frozen at her bench, staring at the empty defendant's chair. Ethan's words echoed in her mind, louder than the murmurs of the gallery, louder than the sound of her gavel. You're not my mom. You're just a stranger in a robe. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. For the first time in her life, Rebecca Lane didn't know how to fix what was broken. All she knew was that she had lost Ethan once, and now she might lose him forever. The meeting room was as unwelcoming as the rest of the juvenile detention center. The dull fluorescent light flickered above, and the gray walls seemed to absorb every ounce of warmth from the space. Rebecca sat on one side of the small metal table, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Across from her, Ethan slouched in his chair, his arms crossed tightly, his posture a barrier she couldn't seem to break. The silence between them was unbearable. I know you're angry, Rebecca finally said, her voice soft but trembling with emotion. She forced herself to look at him, even though his dark, hardened gaze made her want to look away. Ethan scoffed. Angry, he said, his voice sharp and biting. You don't know anything about me. Don't sit there and act like you do. Rebecca flinched but nodded, accepting his words without protest. You're right, she admitted, her tone heavy with guilt. I don't know you, and that's my fault. Ethan didn't respond. He just stared at her, his eyes filled with mistrust and years of pain. Rebecca could feel the weight of his emotions pressing down on her, suffocating her. I'm not here to make excuses, she continued. I'm here because I need you to know the truth. Ethan leaned forward, his jaw tight. The truth. He spat. Now you care about the truth. Where was the truth when you left me? Where was the truth all those years I waited for you to come back? Rebecca's hands trembled as she rested them on the table. I was scared, she said, her voice cracking. I was young, alone, and I thought giving you up was the right thing to do. I thought you'd be better off. Better off. Ethan's voice rose, the anger in his words cutting through the room. Do you know what it's like to grow up thinking you weren't good enough for your own mom to keep you? To feel like nobody wanted you? Tears burned in Rebecca's eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. She needed him to see her pain, to know how much she regretted her choices. I thought about you every day, she said. Every single day. But I was a coward, Ethan. I told myself you were better off without me, and I let that excuse keep me from looking for you. I was wrong. I was so wrong. Ethan's tough exterior began to crack, the walls he had built around himself trembling under the weight of her words. You didn't even try, he said, his voice breaking. You didn't even try. I didn't think you'd want me to, Rebecca admitted. Her tears spilled over now, trailing down her cheeks. I thought you'd hate me. I did hate you, Ethan said, his own tears finally falling. I hated you for leaving me. I hated you for not coming back. But more than anything, I hated that I still wanted you to come. Rebecca's heart shattered at his words. She reached out across the table, her hand trembling. Ethan, she whispered, I know I can't undo what I did. I can't go back and fix the past. But I'm here now. And I want to be here for you, if you'll let me. Ethan stared at her hand, his body stiff with tension. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the sound of his uneven breathing. Then, slowly, he stood up. Rebecca's heart pounded as she watched him, unsure of what he was going to do. And then Ethan did something she didn't expect. He walked around the table and hugged her. It wasn't a long, emotional embrace. It wasn't warm or forgiving. It was awkward, hesitant, and filled with unspoken pain. But it was a start. Rebecca froze for a moment, her body overwhelmed by the unexpected gesture. Then she wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly as her tears soaked into his hoodie. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. Ethan didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The fact that he was there, that he had allowed her to hold him, said more than words ever could. 2 days later, the courtroom was quieter than usual. The media frenzy surrounding Rebecca and Ethan's story had brought a swarm of reporters, but the real drama wasn't in the headlines. It was in the slow, painful process of rebuilding the bridge between mother and son. Rebecca announced her ruling in Ethan's case with a steady voice. The charges of trespassing will not result in incarceration. Instead, Ethan will be placed in a juvenile rehabilitation program where he can receive counseling and support. Her eyes met Ethan's briefly as she continued. This court recognizes that healing requires more than punishment. It requires understanding, accountability, and the chance to rebuild. The reporters scribbled furiously, but Rebecca didn't care about their opinions. All that mattered was the boy sitting at the defendant's table. That evening, Rebecca visited Ethan again. This time, they didn't meet in a cold, sterile room. Instead, they sat outside on a bench in the detention center's courtyard. The winter air was crisp, their breath visible as they spoke. It wasn't a long conversation, and it wasn't an easy one, but it was honest. I'm not ready to forgive you, Ethan said at one point, his voice steady but quiet. Rebecca nodded. I don't expect you to, she replied. But I'll be here when you are. Ethan looked at her, his expression softening slightly. You can't just show up once and think everything's fine. I know, Rebecca said. But I'm not going anywhere this time. I promise. Ethan didn't respond, but he didn't push her away either. They sat there in silence for about an hour. Then, Ethan stood up, hugged her, and went for his dinner. There is hope for new beginnings of something fragile and new forming between them. Slowly, painfully, but surely. And that was enough. What do you think about their story? Could you forgive someone who left you behind, or would the pain be too much? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. If this story touched your heart or kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a little reminder that second chances are possible. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story. Join this community of storytellers where we dive into gripping tales of love, loss, redemption, and everything in between. See you in the next story.